The blood had barely dried on Matthew Armstrong's knuckles when the barn door collapsed on his hands, crushing bones that would never quite heal right again. Charlotte Abbott watched it happen from across the dusty yard of the Double R Ranch outside Gonzales, Texas, her heart stopping as the massive wooden frame gave way and Matthew's scream tore through the humid August air of 1878. She dropped the water pail she had been carrying and ran, her boots kicking up clouds of dirt, her breath catching in her throat as she reached him and saw what remained of his hands trapped beneath splintered oak that had stood for 20 years before rotting from the inside out. The ranch hands pulled the debris away while Charlotte cradled Matthew's head in her lap, his face pale as milk, sweat beading on his forehead despite the shade. She had known Matthew Armstrong for exactly 3 weeks, ever since she had arrived in Gonzales with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a letter of introduction to work as a cook for the ranch. He was the foreman, 24 years old with sun-darkened skin and eyes the color of Texas blue bonnets in spring. She was 22, alone in the world after losing her parents to cholera in Louisiana, and had never expected to feel anything for anyone ever again until she saw him smile at her over morning coffee on her first day. Now his hands looked like something from a nightmare, fingers bent at impossible angles, blood seeping through the dirt and splinters. The ranch owner, old George Rutherford, sent someone riding hard for the doctor in town, but Charlotte knew it would be hours before help arrived. She tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped Matthew's hands as gently as she could while he bit down on a leather strap to keep from screaming. His eyes found hers through the haze of pain, and she saw fear there that had nothing to do with the agony radiating through his body. "The herd," he managed to gasp out between clenched teeth. "Roundup starts in 2 weeks. Need to get them to market in San Antonio before the prices drop." "Hush now," Charlotte said, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. "You just worry about staying conscious until the doctor gets here." But she understood what he was really saying. A foreman who could not rope cattle, could not handle a horse properly, could not do any of the 100 tasks that required strong working hands was no foreman at all. The Double R Ranch depended on getting their cattle to market. 40 men depended on their wages. Matthew Armstrong's entire identity was wrapped up in the leather gloves he wore and the rope he could spin faster than anyone in 3 counties. The doctor arrived as the sun was setting, turning the sky the color of blood and fire. Charlotte stood back and let him work, watching as he set bones and stitched torn skin, shaking his head the entire time. When he finally emerged from the bunkhouse where they'd carried Matthew, his face told the story before his words did. "He will live," Dr. Howell said, wiping his hands on a cloth that came away red. "But those hands will never be the same. The bones are crushed in multiple places. Even if they heal properly, which is far from certain, he will have limited mobility and strength. I would say his days working cattle are finished." Charlotte felt something crack open in her chest. She barely knew this man, yet the thought of him losing everything that mattered to him was unbearable. She had seen the way he moved with the cattle, the quiet confidence, the skill that came from years in the saddle. She had heard the other ranch hands talk about him with respect bordering on reverence. Matthew Armstrong was the best foreman in Gonzales County, and now he was broken. Old George Rutherford stood with his hat in his hands, his weathered face creased with worry. "What am I supposed to do? I cannot run this ranch without a proper foreman, and I cannot afford to keep a man on who cannot work. But Matthew has been with me for 8 years. He is like a son to me." Charlotte spoke before she could think better of it. "I can rope." 3 pairs of eyes turned to her in the gathering darkness. The doctor looked skeptical, old George looked confused, and the young ranch hand who had been standing nearby looked like she had just announced she could fly. "Madam," old George said carefully. "I said I can rope," Charlotte repeated, her voice stronger now. "My father raised cattle in Louisiana before he died. I grew up in the saddle. I can handle a lasso as well as any man here, and I can ride better than most. If Matthew can teach me what needs to be done, Tell me what orders to give. I can be his hands until he heals. If he heals. The words hung in the humid night air like a challenge. Women did not do ranch work in Gonzales, Texas in 1878. They cooked and cleaned and bore children and managed households. They did not rope cattle or ride in roundups or give orders to 40 rough men who spent their days in the saddle and their nights playing cards and drinking whiskey. But Charlotte Abbott had not survived losing everything she loved only to watch someone else lose everything too. Not when she could do something about it. Old George looked at her for a long moment, then slowly nodded. If Matthew agrees to it, and if you can prove you can handle a rope, I will give you a chance, but the roundup starts in 2 weeks, Miss Abbott. That is not much time to learn everything a foreman needs to know. Then we better get started, Charlotte said. Matthew was delirious with laudanum when she entered the bunkhouse, his hands wrapped in white bandages that were already seeping blood. She pulled a chair close to his bed and waited until his eyes focused on her face. Charlotte? His voice was rough, confused. I am going to be your hands, she said simply, until yours heal. I am going to rope for you, ride for you, do whatever needs doing, but you have to teach me. You have to tell me everything. He stared at her like she had lost her mind. You cannot. It is not. Women do not. This one does, Charlotte said firmly. Now rest. Tomorrow we start. She did not give him a chance to argue, just stood and walked out into the night, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. What had she just promised? She could rope, yes, but being able to catch a calf in a pen was vastly different from working 1,000 head of cattle across open range. She had ridden horses all her life, but never on a roundup that would last weeks. She had never given orders to grown men who would resent taking direction from a woman. But she had also never felt the way she did when Matthew Armstrong smiled at her, or when their hands accidentally touched reaching for the same coffee pot, or when he said her name in that slow Texas drawl that made her insides turn to honey. 3 weeks was not long enough to fall in love, but Charlotte was beginning to suspect that love did not follow any particular timeline. The next morning she found Matthew sitting up in bed, his face gray with pain, but his jaw set with determination. His hands lay in his lap like dead things, useless and throbbing. Charlotte had brought coffee and breakfast, but when she set it down, he could not pick up the cup. She lifted it to his lips without comment, and the humiliation in his eyes nearly broke her heart. When he had finished eating, fed like a child by her patient hands, she sat back and waited. "Why are you doing this?" Matthew asked finally. Charlotte considered lying, considered hiding behind practicality and duty and Christian charity, but she had learned that life was too short for anything but honesty. "Because I care what happens to you," she said, "because I know what it feels like to lose everything, and I will not stand by and watch you lose everything too if I can help. And because old George needs his foreman, even if that foreman currently comes in 2 pieces. Matthew closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, something had shifted in his expression. Acceptance, maybe, or the beginning of hope. "All right," he said. "If we are going to do this impossible thing, we need to start now. Get paper and pencil. I am going to tell you everything you need to know about running a ranch, and you are going to learn it faster than anyone has ever learned anything." For the next 2 weeks, Charlotte lived in 2 worlds. In the mornings, she worked in the ranch house kitchen, preparing meals for the hands and old George. In the afternoons and long into the evenings, she sat with Matthew while he taught her everything he knew. How to read the weather in the Texas sky, how to spot a sick cow in a herd of hundreds, how to judge the quality of grass and water, how to organize men into efficient teams, how to handle the ornery bulls and the skittish heifers and everything in between, but teaching was only half of it. Charlotte also spent hours each day in the practice pen with a lasso, working until her hands were raw and blistered, until she could drop a loop over a fence post from 30 feet away without thinking. She practiced on the calves, then the yearlings, then the full-grown steers, learning to adjust for weight and speed, and the sheer stubbornness of a longhorn that did not want to be caught. The ranch hands watched her with expressions ranging from amusement to outright hostility. Jack Donovan, the segundo who should have taken over as foreman but lacked Matthew's skills and knowledge, made his opinion clear from the start. "This is a fool's errand," he announced loudly in the bunkhouse one evening, his voice carrying clearly to where Charlotte was helping Matthew eat his dinner. "We are going to be the laughingstock of Texas, riding out with a woman in charge. Might as well paint the cattle pink and teach them to dance while we are at it." Charlotte set down the spoon and walked to the bunkhouse door, pushing it open without knocking. 40 pairs of eyes turned to her, some curious, some hostile, some carefully neutral. "You are right that I am a woman," she said clearly, "but I can outride and outrope most of you, and I have Matthew Armstrong's knowledge backing every decision I make. So you can either get on board with this, or you can draw your pay and leave right now. But if you stay, you follow my orders just like you would follow his. Are we clear?" The silence stretched out like taffy. Then, surprisingly, old Tom Garcia, who had been working cattle since before Charlotte was born, stood up and nodded. "I reckon if Matthew trusts you, that is good enough for me," he said. "And I saw you rope yesterday. You have got good hands, Miss Abbott." One by one, others nodded agreement. Jack Donovan scowled but said nothing more, and Charlotte took that as the closest thing to victory she was likely to get. The night before the roundup began, Charlotte sat with Matthew under a sky full of stars that looked close enough to touch. His hands had been rebandaged fresh that morning, and Dr. Howell had said the bones seemed to be setting properly, though it would be months before they knew for sure if he would regain any real function. Matthew had managed to wiggle his fingers slightly that afternoon, and the triumph on his face had been better than anything Charlotte had ever seen. "You do not have to do this," Matthew said quietly. "It is not too late to back out. Jack could lead the roundup. He is not as good, but he knows the work." "Jack could not organize a prayer meeting in a church," Charlotte said, "and I am not backing out. We are in this together now, Matthew Armstrong, you and me." He turned to look at her, and in the starlight his face was all plains and shadows. "Why do you care so much? You barely know me." Charlotte reached out and took one of his bandaged hands carefully in both of hers, mindful of the damage beneath the cloth. "I know enough. I know you are kind to the horses even when they're being difficult. I know you remember the names of all the ranch hands' children. I know you gave your extra blanket to young Tommy Reeves when he was shivering through his first winter here, and you pretended you did not need it even though I saw you sleeping under your coat. I know when you talk about this land, your whole face lights up like you are seeing something holy. That is enough for me to know." Matthew was quiet for so long she thought maybe she had said too much, revealed too much of the feelings that had been growing in her heart like wildflowers after rain. But then his fingers twitched in her grip, trying to curl around her hands even though the movement made him wince. "When this is over," he said slowly, "when the herd is sold and the money is in the bank, and my hands are whatever they are going to be, I would like to court you properly, if you would allow it." Charlotte felt her breath catch. "I would like that very much. Even if I never rope again, even if I am not the man I was." She squeezed his hands gently. "You are more than what you can do with your hands, Matthew Armstrong. And anyway, we make a good team. Your knowledge, my hands. Maybe that is how it is meant to be." He smiled then, slow and warm, and Charlotte thought that no matter what happened on the roundup, this moment was worth everything. The morning of the roundup dawned clear and hot, the kind of Texas August day that made you think you could wring water out of the air itself. Charlotte dressed in borrowed work clothes, trousers, and a shirt that had belonged to one of the smaller ranch hands, her hair braided tight and tucked under a wide-brimmed hat. When she walked out to where the men were gathering with their horses, a ripple of reaction went through the crowd. "Listen up," old George called out, his voice carrying across the yard. "You all know Miss Abbott is riding as foreman on this roundup. She has Matthew's full backing and mine. You will treat her with respect and follow her orders. Anyone who has a problem with that can collect their pay right now and ride out. We have cattle to move and no time for nonsense. Nobody move to leave. though Jack Donovan's face was stormy. Charlotte swung up onto her horse, a rangy bay mare named Rosie, who had a reputation for speed and smarts, and rode to the front of the group. Matthew sat in a wagon driven by young Tommy Reeves, his bandaged hands resting on his lap. He had insisted on coming along despite Dr. Howell's protests, arguing that Charlotte would need him nearby to consult with when decisions needed to be made. "All right," Charlotte called out, her voice steady, even though her heart was racing. "Tom, take 10 men and sweep the eastern range. Jack, you take the western section with another 10. The rest of you are with me on the southern territory. We meet back at the holding pen by sundown with whatever we have gathered. Stay alert for strays in the brush and watch out for rattlers. It is hot enough that they will be looking for shade, which means they will be exactly where the cattle are." The men moved out in organized groups, and Charlotte allowed herself one moment of relief before spurring Rosie forward. The real work was just beginning. The southern territory of the Double R Ranch was 3,000 acres of rolling grassland broken by stands of live oak and mesquite, with a creek running through the center that was barely more than a trickle in the August heat. The cattle were scattered across all of it, some in groups, some alone, all of them ornery and stubborn after a summer of relative freedom. Charlotte rode alongside the hands, her lasso ready, calling out directions and adjustments as they flushed cattle out of the brush and started moving them toward the holding pen. The first time she had to rope a running steer, Charlotte felt every eye on her. The animal was big, easily 1,200 pounds, and it had no interest in being caught. She urged Rosie into a gallop, building her loop as she rode, timing the throw for the exact moment when the steer's head was at the right angle. The rope sailed through the air and dropped perfectly over the horns, and Charlotte dallied it around her saddle horn and brought the steer up short. A cheer went up from some of the hands, and Charlotte felt a grin split her face. She looked back at the wagon where Matthew sat watching, and the pride in his eyes was worth every blister on her hands. By sundown on the first day, they had gathered nearly 300 head in the holding pen, and Charlotte was so exhausted she could barely stay in the saddle. Her legs ached, her back hurt, and her hands were bleeding through the leather gloves she wore. But when she rode up to the wagon and saw Matthew's expression, all the pain faded into the background. "You were magnificent," he said simply. Charlotte climbed down from Rosie and nearly fell over, her legs cramping from hours in the saddle. Matthew's good humor faded into concern, and he called for Tommy to help her to the chuck wagon where food was being served. She wanted to protest that she could walk on her own, but the truth was she was not sure she could. That night, after the men had eaten and rolled out their bedrolls under the stars, Charlotte sat by the fire and let Matthew examine her hands. He could not actually do anything to help, but he studied the blisters and raw patches with a frown that made her want to smooth the worry from his forehead. "You're pushing too hard," he said. "I am doing what needs doing," Charlotte corrected, "same as you always did." "I never had to prove I belonged out here. You do, every single minute of every single day. That is not fair." "Life is not fair," Charlotte said. "If it was, your hands would not be broken and my parents would still be alive and we would not be sitting here having this conversation. But this is what we have, so we make the best of it." Matthew was quiet for a moment, then said carefully, "You are the strongest person I have ever met." Charlotte felt her cheeks heat. "I am just doing what anyone would do." "No," Matthew said firmly. "You are doing what you would do, and that is something special. Do not sell yourself short, Charlotte Abbott." She looked up at him, this man who had been a stranger a month ago and was now somehow essential to her existence, and felt something shift and settle in her chest. This was what love felt like, she realized. Not the dramatic, sweeping passion of dime novels, but this steady certainty that you wanted to be next to this person through whatever came, good or bad, easy or hard. "Get some rest," Matthew said gently. "Tomorrow will be even harder." He was right. The second day of the roundup was brutal, with temperatures climbing over 100 degrees and several steers deciding they would rather die than be herded. Charlotte spent the morning roping cattle out of thorny mesquite thickets that tore at her clothes and skin, and the afternoon dealing with a small stampede when something spooked the herd in the holding pen. By the time they got the cattle settled again, she had rope burns on top of her blisters and a bruise on her thigh from where a steer had kicked her. But they also had 500 head gathered, which was better than expected for 2 days' work. Old George rode out from the ranch house to check on progress and could not hide his surprise at what Charlotte and the hands had accomplished. "You might just pull this off, Kinkus," he said wonderingly. "I confess I had my doubts, but you have won the men over. Even Jack has stopped grumbling, at least where I can hear him." Charlotte was too tired to feel triumphant. She just nodded and went to check on the water supply, making sure both cattle and horses had enough to drink in the oppressive heat. That night, she fell asleep as soon as her head hit her bedroll, not even bothering to eat the stew that the cook had prepared. She woke before dawn to find that someone had covered her with a blanket and left food nearby in case she got hungry. When she asked who, Tommy Reeves admitted sheepishly that Matthew had directed him to do it. "He watches you all the time," Tommy said. "Too young at 17 to be subtle. Looks at you like you hung the moon and stars, Miss Abbott." Charlotte felt her heart do something complicated in her chest. She had been so focused on the work, on proving herself, on keeping Matthew's position secure, that she had not let herself think too much about the feelings between them. But now in the gray light before dawn, she let herself acknowledge the truth. She loved Matthew Armstrong, loved him with a fierceness that surprised her, and she was almost certain he loved her back. The thought should have been frightening, given how recently they had met and how uncertain everything was, but instead it felt right, like a piece of her had clicked into place. The roundup continued for another week, each day a test of endurance and skill. Charlotte roped cattle until her arms felt like they might fall off, rode Rosie until the mare was so tired she stumbled over flat ground, and made decisions that affected 40 men and 1,000 head of cattle. She settled disputes between hands, dealt with injuries when a horse threw a rider and when a bull decided to charge instead of run, and kept careful track of which sections of the range had been thoroughly swept and which still needed attention. Through it all, Matthew was there in the wagon, a steady presence even when he could not physically help. Charlotte consulted with him multiple times each day, riding back to wherever the wagon was positioned to ask advice or confirm plans. His knowledge was encyclopedic, covering everything from which water sources were reliable to which cattle were most likely to cause trouble based on markings and behavior. Without him, Charlotte would have been lost. With him, she was unstoppable. The men noticed. By the middle of the second week, even the most skeptical hands had started treating Charlotte with genuine respect rather than grudging tolerance. They asked her opinion, followed her orders without hesitation, and several times she caught them defending her to newer hands who grumbled about taking direction from a woman. "She is tougher than half you lazy cowards," old Tom Garcia said one evening, his voice carrying clearly, "and twice as smart, so shut your mouth and do your job." Charlotte pretended she had not heard, but the warmth in her chest lingered for hours. On the 15th day, they gathered the last of the cattle and did a final count. 1,047 head, more than old George had expected, and more than enough to make the drive to San Antonio worthwhile. Charlotte sat on Rosie and looked at the enormous herd, dust rising from 1,000 hooves, the sound of lowing cattle filling the air, and felt a sense of accomplishment unlike anything she had ever experienced. "We did it," she said when Matthew's wagon rolled up beside her. "You did it," Matthew corrected. "I just sat in a wagon and gave advice." "You did more than that," Charlotte said firmly. "This was us, Matthew, together." The drive to San Antonio would take another 2 weeks, moving the herd slowly across 150 miles of Texas territory. Charlotte had studied the route with Matthew, memorizing water sources and good grazing spots, places where the trail narrowed and required extra attention. River crossings that could be dangerous if not handled properly. She had never been to San Antonio, but Matthew had made the drive a dozen times and knew every mile. They set out on a Monday morning. The herd strung out in a long line with experienced hands riding point and drag, keeping the cattle moving at a steady pace. Charlotte rode near the front, her eyes constantly scanning for problems, her mind running through the 100 things that could go wrong. Stampedes, injuries, predators, rustlers, weather, simple exhaustion, any of them could derail the drive and cost the ranch everything. The first few days went smoothly, the cattle settling into the rhythm of walking, grazing, walking again. They covered 10 to 12 miles a day, which was good time, stopping early enough each afternoon to let the herd rest and feed. At night, Charlotte organized the watch rotation, making sure tired men got sleep while fresh eyes watched for trouble. She still ate dinner with Matthew every evening, sitting by his wagon and filling him in on the day's events while helping him eat. His hands were slightly better. The swelling reduced enough that he could move his fingers more freely, though the doctor had warned that true healing would take months. Charlotte cleaned and re-bandaged them each night, her touch as gentle as she could make it, trying not to show how much it hurt her to see him like this. On the 5th night of the drive, Matthew caught her hand as she finished wrapping his left palm, his fingers curling around hers with visible effort. "I need to say something," he began, his voice low enough that the hand sitting nearby could not hear. "And I know the timing is terrible with everything else going on, but I cannot hold it in anymore." Charlotte's heart started beating faster. "What is it?" "I am in love with you," Matthew said simply. "I have been since the day you arrived at the ranch and smiled at me over that coffee pot. But I did not want to say anything because I am your employer, and you might have felt obligated to respond a certain way. And then this happened." He lifted his bandaged hand slightly, "and you stepped in like an avenging angel and took over my entire life, and I fell even harder. So I am saying it now, even though we are in the middle of a cattle drive and I cannot even hold your hand properly. I love you, Charlotte Abbott, and when this is over, I want to marry you if you will have me." Charlotte sat very still, the Texas night air warm around them, the distant sound of cattle and the crackle of the campfire the only noises. She had known on some level that this was coming. But hearing the words out loud, seeing the vulnerability in Matthew's eyes, made it real in a way that took her breath. "Yes," she said softly. Matthew blinked. "Yes, you love me, or yes, you will marry me." "Both," Charlotte said, leaning in carefully to kiss him, mindful of his injuries. "Yes to everything, Matthew. I love you and I want to spend my life with you, broken hands and all." His smile could have lit up all of Texas. He kissed her back clumsily, unable to pull her close the way he clearly wanted to, and Charlotte made up for it by wrapping her arms around his neck and pouring everything she felt into the kiss. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, several of the nearby ranch hands were pointedly looking away, but Tom Garcia was grinning openly. "About time," the old man called out. "We have been running a betting pool on when you two would figure it out." Charlotte felt her face flame red, but she could not stop smiling. Matthew laughed, the sound free and joyful in a way she had not heard since before his accident. The rest of the drive took on a dream-like quality. Charlotte was still working harder than she ever had in her life, still making dozens of decisions every day, still riding from dawn to dusk. But now she did it knowing that Matthew loved her, that they had a future together beyond this cattle drive. She caught herself daydreaming about what that future might look like, where they would live, whether they would stay on the Double R Ranch or start their own place someday. On the 10th day, they reached the Guadalupe River at a crossing point that Matthew had used many times before. The water was low due to the dry summer, which should have made it easy. But Charlotte saw immediately that someone had been there recently, torn up the bank on the far side, making it muddy and unstable. Taking over 1,000 cattle across would be risky. She consulted with Matthew, who frowned at her description of the conditions. "There is another crossing about 5 miles north, but it will cost us half a day to reach it. Your call, foreman." Charlotte chewed her lip, thinking through the options. The delay would put them behind schedule, but pushing through a risky crossing could result in injuries or lost cattle, which would be worse. She made her decision. We go north to the other crossing. Better to arrive a day late with a full herd than on time with half of one. Matthew nodded approvingly. That is what I would have said. The alternate crossing was clean and safe, and they got the herd across without incident, though it meant camping that night on the bank of the river instead of 5 miles further down the trail. Charlotte did not mind. She sat by the water with Matthew after the cattle had settled, watching moonlight reflect off the slow-moving current. Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not come to Gonzales? Matthew asked. Charlotte considered the question. I suppose I would have ended up in another town, found another cooking job, maybe married someone eventually, if the right person came along. But I cannot imagine it would have been this. This being a cattle drive where you're doing my job because I broke my hands. This being a life where I get to be myself instead of trying to fit into what everyone expects, Charlotte said. Before I met you, I thought I would spend the rest of my life being quiet and proper and doing what women are supposed to do. But you needed someone who could rope, and I can rope, so I did. And now I know I do not have to be what everyone expects. I can just be Charlotte, whoever that turns out to be. Matthew reached out and managed to take her hand, his grip weak but present. I like Charlotte, whoever she turns out to be. Though I have to admit, watching you rope cattle while wearing trousers has been extremely distracting. Charlotte laughed and swatted his arm gently. You are incorrigible. I am in love, Matthew corrected. It makes a man say foolish things. They sat together until the stars came out in full force, a blanket of light stretching from horizon to horizon, and Charlotte thought she had never been happier in her entire life. San Antonio appeared on the horizon on the 14th day, a sprawling city that was enormous compared to tiny Gonzales. Charlotte had never seen so many buildings clustered together, so many people in the streets. They drove the herd to the stockyards on the outskirts of town, where buyers were waiting to inspect the cattle and make offers. Old George had ridden ahead to meet them, and he walked through the pens with the buyers while Charlotte stood nervously nearby. She had gotten the cattle here safely, but if they did not get a good price, all the hard work would be for nothing. The ranch needed this money to survive another year, to pay the hands and buy supplies and keep operating. After what felt like hours, but was probably only 30 minutes, old George emerged from the pens with a satisfied smile. We got a very good price, he said. Better than I expected, actually. The buyers said these are some of the healthiest cattle they have seen this season, which I credit to you getting them here fast and keeping them well watered and fed along the way. Relief flooded through Charlotte so powerfully that her knees went weak. So the ranch is secure for another year? The ranch is very secure, old George confirmed. You did it, Miss Abbott. You saved us. Charlotte turned to where Matthew sat in the wagon, his face alight with pride and joy. We did it, she said, echoing the words from the end of the roundup. Together. That night, old George paid the hands their wages and gave them leave to spend a few days in San Antonio before the ride back to Gonzales. Most of them headed straight for the saloons and gaming halls, eager to spend their hard-earned money on whiskey and women and cards. But Charlotte stayed at the wagon with Matthew, too exhausted to do anything but collapse onto her bedroll. You should go celebrate, Matthew said. You earned it. I am exactly where I want to be, Charlotte said, her eyes already drifting closed. Right here with you. She woke in the morning to find that Matthew had managed to drape a blanket over her one-handed, and there was fresh coffee sitting nearby that he must have asked someone to bring. The thought of him trying to take care of her even when he could barely use his hands made her heart swell. They spent 2 days in San Antonio, resting and resupplying before beginning the journey back to Gonzales. The return trip was leisurely compared to the drive out, with no cattle to manage and no real urgency. Charlotte rode beside the wagon, and she and Matthew talked for hours, sharing stories from their childhoods, their hopes for the future, the 1,000 small details that people in love want to know about each other. She learned that Matthew's mother had died when he was 12, and his father had raised him and his 2 younger sisters alone until dying of pneumonia when Matthew was 18. She learned that he had worked a dozen different jobs before finding his way to the Double R Ranch, that he had once wanted to be a teacher but never had the chance for proper schooling. She learned that his favorite food was apple pie, that he was terrified of snakes but refused to show it, and that he sang when he thought no one was listening, a low, tuneless humming that made her smile every time. In turn, she told him about growing up in Louisiana, about her mother's herb garden and her father's booming laugh, about the cholera epidemic that had taken them both within days and left Charlotte alone at 20 years old. She told him about the loneliness of the past 2 years, drifting from town to town, never putting down roots because it hurt too much to get attached to anything. She told him that coming to Gonzales had felt like coming home in a way she could not quite explain, and he had squeezed her hand with his improving grip and said he felt exactly the same way about her. They arrived back at the Double R Ranch on a golden September afternoon, the brutal heat of August finally broken by cooler weather. Old George met them in the yard, his face split in a genuine smile, and announced that there would be a celebration that evening to honor the successful drive and to properly thank Charlotte for her work. "I also have something else to announce," he added, looking at Matthew and Charlotte with knowing eyes. "I am getting too old for this ranching business. The last month proved that. So I am making you a proposition, Matthew. I will sell you the Double R at a price you can afford to pay over time. You can be owner instead of foreman, build this place into whatever you want it to be, and I assume Miss Abbott will be part of that plan?" Matthew looked at Charlotte, his blue eyes asking a silent question. She nodded, her heart in her throat. "We would be honored," Matthew said, "though I have to warn you Charlotte might end up running the place since my hands are still not right." "From what I saw on this drive, that would not be the worst thing in the world," old George said with a chuckle. "You two make quite a team." The celebration that evening was everything Charlotte never knew she wanted. The ranch hands toasted her repeatedly, thanking her for saving their jobs and for the best roundup and drive in years. Tom Garcia made a speech about how she had proven that skill and heart mattered more than whether you wore trousers or a dress. Even Jack Donovan grudgingly admitted that she had done a good job, though he still looked like the words hurt coming out. Charlotte stood beside Matthew and felt truly part of something for the first time since losing her parents. This ranch, these men, this life, it was hers now, if she wanted it. And she definitely wanted it. In late September, on a clear, cool day that felt like a gift after the brutal summer, Charlotte Abbott married Matthew Armstrong in the small church in Gonzales. She wore a simple blue dress that had belonged to her mother, and Matthew wore his best shirt with his hands still wrapped in bandages, though he could move his fingers now and had started doing exercises to regain strength. Old George stood up with them as witness, along with Tom Garcia and half the ranch hands, who had all scrubbed clean and put on their Sunday best for the occasion. Reverend Thompson performed the ceremony, his voice sonorous in the tiny church. When he got to the part about exchanging rings, Matthew fumbled slightly but managed to slide a simple gold band onto Charlotte's finger without dropping it. She did the same for him, careful of his healing hands, and when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Matthew kissed her with such tenderness that she felt tears prick her eyes. They held the reception at the ranch with tables set up in the yard and food that Charlotte had helped prepare despite everyone telling her the bride should not cook at her own wedding. There was music from a fiddle player who worked on a neighboring ranch, and dancing that lasted well into the evening. Charlotte danced with Matthew despite his protests that he could not hold her properly, and they swayed together under strings of lanterns while the ranch hands clapped and cheered. "Happy?" Matthew asked, his voice low against her ear. "Happier than I knew was possible," Charlotte answered honestly. They spent their wedding night in the foreman's cabin that was now theirs, a small but comfortable space with a real bed and a wood stove and windows that looked out over the ranch. Matthew's hands were still too damaged to do many things, but he could touch her face, could run his fingers through her hair, could hold her as close as his strength allowed. Charlotte made up for any deficiencies, and they loved each other slowly and carefully, learning each other's bodies with the same patience and attention they had shown learning to work together. Afterward, lying tangled in sheets with the Texas stars visible through the window, Charlotte felt complete in a way she had not since before her parents died. She had found not just love, but purpose, not just a husband, but a true partner. "I never thanked you properly," Matthew said into the darkness. "For what you did. You saved me, Charlotte. Not just my job, but me. I was ready to give up when the barn fell on my hands, but you would not let me." "You would have done the same for me," Charlotte said simply. "Maybe," Matthew admitted, "but you actually did it. That is what matters." The fall and winter that followed were a time of adjustment and growth. Matthew's hands healed slowly, regaining some but not all of their former strength and mobility. He could handle a rope again, though not with his previous skill, and he could work with horses and cattle, though he tired more easily than before. The limitations frustrated him, but Charlotte reminded him constantly that he was more than what he could do with his hands. Together they managed the Double R Ranch as equal partners, with Charlotte handling much of the physical work and Matthew providing knowledge and oversight. It was an unusual arrangement that raised eyebrows in Gonzales, where proper wives were not supposed to work cattle alongside men. But the success of the ranch spoke for itself, and gradually the gossip died down. In January of 1879, Charlotte realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. She had always wanted children, but had given up on the possibility after losing her parents, thinking she would spend her life alone. Now she was married to the man she loved and carrying his child, and the future suddenly felt almost too bright to look at directly. Matthew was thrilled, though also immediately overprotective in ways that drove Charlotte slightly crazy. He wanted her to stop working with the cattle, to rest more, to let others handle the heavy tasks. Charlotte ignored most of his suggestions and continued doing what she had always done, though she did avoid the more dangerous work as her pregnancy progressed. In late August, almost exactly a year after the barn had fallen on Matthew's hands, Charlotte gave birth to a healthy baby boy. They named him Daniel George Armstrong, after Matthew's father and the man who had given them their start. Charlotte held her son and marveled at his tiny, perfect fingers, his shock of dark hair, his blue eyes that were identical to his father's. Matthew cradled Daniel carefully in his scarred hands, tears running down his face. "He is perfect," he whispered, "just like his mother." "He is ours," Charlotte said. "That is what makes him perfect." The years that followed were full and rich, marked by hard work and deep love in equal measure. The Double R Ranch prospered under their joint management, gaining a reputation for quality cattle and fair dealing. Charlotte became known throughout the region as one of the best ropers in Texas, man or woman, and eventually stopped even thinking about the fact that she was unusual. This was just who she was: a rancher, a wife, a mother, a woman who could handle a lasso and gentle a horse and manage 40 men without breaking a sweat. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Elizabeth in 1881 and another son named Henry in 1884. Charlotte taught all of them to ride and rope as soon as they were old enough to sit a horse, passing on the skills her own father had taught her. Matthew taught them about the land, about reading weather and managing herds, about the 1,000 pieces of knowledge required to make a ranch successful. Matthew's hands never fully recovered, but they regained enough function that he could do most of what needed doing. He wore gloves constantly to protect the worst of the scars, and cold weather made his fingers ache, but he learned to work within his limitations. And when he could not do something himself, Charlotte was there to be his hands, just as she had promised on that first terrible day. On their 10th wedding anniversary in 1889, they sat on the porch of the house they had built to replace the foreman's cabin, watching their children play in the yard while the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold. Daniel was 10 now, already showing signs of his father's height and his mother's determination. Elizabeth was 8, fearless and wild, always the first to volunteer for any adventure. Henry was 5, quiet and thoughtful, with a gift for gentling even the most skittish horses. "Do you ever regret it?" Matthew asked, taking Charlotte's hand in his scarred one. "Giving up a normal life to marry a broken-down cowboy and work yourself to exhaustion running a ranch?" Charlotte squeezed his hand, feeling the rough texture of old scars and the familiar strength that remained. "Not for a single second. This is exactly the life I was meant to live. With you, with our children, with this land, I would not change a single thing. Not even the part where a barn fell on me and you had to take over as foreman." Charlotte considered, then shook her head. "Especially not that part. That is when I learned what I was really capable of. That is when we became partners instead of just two people who liked each other. Your broken hands gave me the chance to be more than what everyone expected, and that is a gift I will always treasure." Matthew pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her with all the strength he had. "I love you. Charlotte Armstrong, thank you for being my hands when I needed them, and my heart always." "Always," Charlotte agreed, and kissed him as the sun sank below the horizon, and their children's laughter filled the Texas evening. The ranch continued to thrive in the years following their 10th anniversary, becoming one of the most successful operations in Gonzales County. Charlotte's reputation grew beyond just being a skilled roper. She became known as a savvy businesswoman who could negotiate prices with buyers, manage finances, and make strategic decisions about breeding and land management. She was frequently consulted by other ranchers, including men who had initially scoffed at the idea of a woman doing ranch work. Matthew's role evolved as well. While he could no longer do the most physically demanding work, his knowledge and experience made him invaluable in other ways. He became an expert in breeding programs, developing bloodlines that produced cattle known throughout Texas for their hardiness and quality beef. He also took over most of the bookkeeping and correspondence, tasks that required patience and attention to detail rather than manual dexterity. Their children grew into capable young people who loved the ranch as much as their parents did. Daniel, by the time he was 15, could already rope and ride as well as most grown men. He had inherited his father's eye for cattle and his mother's work ethic, and it was clear he would take over the ranch someday. Elizabeth shocked everyone by announcing at age 13 that she wanted to be a veterinarian, having spent years watching Dr. Howell treat injured animals and developing a gift for healing. Matthew and Charlotte supported her ambition wholeheartedly, even though most people thought it was impossible for a woman to pursue such a profession. Henry, true to his gentle nature, preferred working with horses over cattle, and showed signs of becoming a master trainer. In the summer of 1892, when Charlotte was 36 and Matthew 38, they faced their first major crisis since those early days. A severe drought hit Texas, the worst in decades, turning the grasslands brown and drying up water sources across the region. Cattle were dying by the hundreds on neighboring ranches, and many operations went under as the heat stretched on week after week without rain. Charlotte and Matthew worked together to manage the crisis, drawing on every bit of knowledge and experience they had accumulated. They moved the herd to higher ground where some grass remained, dug deeper wells to reach underground water, and made the difficult decision to sell off a portion of their cattle early before they lost weight and value. It meant less profit that year, but it kept the remaining herd healthy and the ranch solvent. "This is what partnership means," Charlotte said one evening as they reviewed their finances by lamplight, "making hard decisions together and trusting each other's judgment." Matthew nodded, rubbing his aching hands absently. "I could not do this without you. I mean that literally, even if my hands worked perfectly, I could not run this ranch alone. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Charlotte. The barn falling on my hands was the worst day of my life, but it brought me you so I would live through it again in a heartbeat." Charlotte felt her throat tighten with emotion. After 14 years of marriage, Matthew could still make her feel like that young woman who had first arrived at the ranch, falling in love over morning coffee. "We are going to be fine," she said firmly. "This drought will end, the rains will come, and we will rebuild. That is what we do." She was right. The rains came in September, gentle at first and then building to steady downpours that turned the land green again. By the following spring, the Double R Ranch had recovered fully, and they were able to buy additional land from a neighbor who had decided to give up ranching and move back east. The additional acreage allowed them to expand their operation and provided more grazing land for future dry years. As the 1890s progressed, the Wild West that Charlotte and Matthew had known was slowly disappearing. The open range was being fenced in, the great cattle drives were becoming less common as railroads expanded, and towns were growing into proper cities with electricity and telephone lines. But the Double R Ranch remained a place where the old ways persisted, where skill with a rope and knowledge of cattle still mattered more than modern conveniences. Charlotte turned 40 in 1896, and Matthew surprised her with a gift that left her speechless: a brand new saddle, custom made in San Antonio, with her name tooled into the leather, along with an image of a woman roping a steer. It was beautiful and practical and perfectly her, and she cried when she saw it. "You have earned the best equipment," Matthew said, wrapping his arms around her from behind as she ran her fingers over the intricate tooling. "You are the finest roper in Texas, Charlotte Armstrong, and everyone should know it." That same year, Elizabeth left home to attend veterinary college in Austin, one of the first women accepted into the program. Charlotte and Matthew were immensely proud, even as they missed her terribly. She wrote long letters home describing her studies and the challenges of being the only woman in most of her classes, and Charlotte saved every one of them. Daniel began courting a young woman from town, the daughter of the general store owner, and it was clear wedding bells were in the future. Henry, at 17, was still more interested in horses than girls, spending every spare moment training colts and developing innovative gentling techniques. In 1899, as the century drew to a close, Charlotte and Matthew sat together on their porch, much as they had on their 10th anniversary, though with 20 years of marriage behind them now instead of 10. Matthew's hair was shot through with silver, and his hands had developed arthritis that made them ache constantly in cold weather. Charlotte had lines at the corners of her eyes and silver threads in her dark hair, and her body bore the marks of years of hard work, old rope burns, scars from encounters with cattle, joints that protested when she first got out of bed in the morning. But they were happy, deeply and genuinely happy, in a way that had only grown stronger over time. They had built something lasting together, not just a successful ranch, but a real partnership based on mutual respect and love. 21 years since that barn fell, Matthew said quietly, looking at his scarred hands in the fading light. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime ago. It was a lifetime ago, Charlotte said. We were different people then, younger, less certain of ourselves, just beginning to figure out what we could be together. Do you think you would have fallen in love with me if it had not happened? If I had just been the foreman with working hands and you had been the cook? Charlotte considered the question seriously. I think I would have fallen in love with you eventually, yes, but it might have taken longer and it might have been different. The accident forced us to really see each other, to work together in ways we might never have otherwise. It showed me who you really were, your strength, your vulnerability, your willingness to trust me. And it showed you who I was too. The woman who saved my life, Matthew said. The woman who loved you enough to try, Charlotte corrected. That is all I did, Matthew. I loved you and I tried my best. The rest we figured out together. They sat in comfortable silence as the stars came out, the familiar sounds of the ranch settling down for the night around them. Somewhere in the distance, cattle lowed softly. Closer by, horses nickered in their corral. Inside the house, the clock that had belonged to Charlotte's parents chimed the hour. This was their life, built from moments like this one, from hard work and harder choices, from love that had started as a spark and grown into something unshakable. Charlotte thought about that desperate young woman who had stepped off the stage in Gonzales 21 years ago, alone and grieving and uncertain of her future. She wished she could go back and tell that woman that everything would be all right, that she would find not just love, but purpose, not just a home, but a place where she truly belonged. But then again, maybe the not knowing had been necessary. Maybe Charlotte had needed to figure it all out herself, step by uncertain step, just as Matthew had needed to learn that his value was not tied solely to what his hands could do. In 1901, Daniel married his sweetheart Sarah in a ceremony at the church in Gonzales, and by 1902, Charlotte and Matthew were grandparents to a baby girl named Grace. Elizabeth graduated from veterinary college and shocked everyone by returning to Gonzales to set up her own practice, becoming the first female veterinarian in the region. Henry married a young woman who shared his love of horses, and they began breeding and training stock for sale across Texas. The Double R Ranch entered the new century as a family operation in the truest sense, with 3 generations working the land together. Charlotte gradually began teaching Daniel everything she knew about running the ranch, preparing him to take over someday. But she was nowhere near ready to retire at 45. She could still outrope men half her age, and she had no intention of slowing down anytime soon. Matthew's hands continued to plague him, especially as he aged, but he had long since made peace with their limitations. They were part of his story, part of what had brought him and Charlotte together, and he would not change that even if he could. The scars were a reminder that sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing in your life. On a warm spring evening in 1904, Charlotte and Matthew celebrated their 25th wedding anniversary with their children, their spouses, and their grandchildren gathered around them. They had a feast prepared by the whole family with music and dancing and stories told late into the night. Daniel gave a toast thanking his parents for building something worth inheriting, for showing him what real partnership looked like. Elizabeth thanked them for supporting her unconventional dreams. Henry thanked them for teaching him to be gentle with himself and others. When everyone else had finally gone to bed, Charlotte and Matthew remained by the fire, her head on his shoulder, his scarred hands holding hers. 25 years, Charlotte mused. Sometimes I still cannot believe it. That desperate day when I offered to be your hands feels like it happened to different people. In a way it did, Matthew said. We have become different people together. Better people, I think. Definitely better, Charlotte agreed. She lifted his hands, kissing the worst of the scars gently. These hands built our life. Maybe they could not hold a rope for a while, but they held me, held our children, held everything that mattered. You did the roping, Matthew reminded her, while I healed slow. We both healed, Charlotte said. Me from losing my parents, you from losing your hands' full function, and we healed together, which made all the difference. Matthew pulled her closer, as close as the aged wood of the porch rocking chairs would allow. I love you, Charlotte Armstrong. I loved you when you were young and fierce and determined to save me from myself. I love you now when you are still fierce and determined, but also wise and patient, and the best partner anyone could ask for. I will love you until the day I die, and probably beyond that too. Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes, but they were happy tears, the kind that came from being overwhelmed by gratitude for the life she had been given. I love you too, Matthew. Always have, always will. They sat together under the stars, 2 people who had found each other when they both needed saving, who had built something beautiful from broken hands and broken hearts, who had proven that love and partnership could overcome any obstacle. The ranch stretched out around them in the darkness, every acre of it marked by their shared effort and sacrifice and triumph. This was their legacy, not just the land or the cattle or even their children, but the story of 2 people who refused to give up on each other or themselves, who found strength in partnership and grace in healing, who turned disaster into destiny and broken pieces into something whole. As the fire burned down to embers and the night grew quiet, Charlotte thought about all the moments that had led them here. The barn falling, her desperate offer to help, those first fumbling attempts at working together, the roundup and the drive, the proposal under the stars, the wedding, the children, the challenges and triumphs of 25 years. Every single moment had been necessary. Every struggle had made them stronger. Every choice had led them to this perfect peace. Ready for another 25 years? Matthew asked softly. Ready for whatever comes, Charlotte replied, as long as we face it together. They went inside eventually to the home they had built and the life they had created hand in scarred hand, hearts full of love and gratitude. Outside, the Texas stars blazed overhead, constant and bright, watching over the ranch where 2 broken people had found each other and made themselves whole. The years continued to unfold with the gentle rhythm of ranch life, each season bringing its own challenges and joys. Charlotte and Matthew grew older together, their hair turning silver, their bodies bearing the marks of decades of hard work, but their partnership only deepening with time. They worked side by side until well into their 60s, when they finally began stepping back to let Daniel take the lead in daily operations. Even in their retirement years, though, they remained active in the life of the ranch. Charlotte could still handle a rope when needed, though she saved her energy for teaching her grandchildren the skills her father had taught her. Matthew spent his days breeding champion cattle and writing down everything he knew about ranch management, creating a manual that would guide the Armstrong family for generations. They watched with pride as their children and grandchildren built their own lives, carrying forward the values of hard work, partnership, and resilience that Charlotte and Matthew had embodied. The Double R Ranch became known not just for quality cattle, but for being a place where family came first, where women worked alongside men as equals, where everyone contributed according to their abilities. On a golden afternoon in 1910, when Charlotte was 54 and Matthew 56, they rode out together to a favorite spot on the ranch, a hill that overlooked the entire property with a view that stretched for miles. They sat in comfortable silence, watching cattle graze in the distance, seeing their grandchildren playing near the house far below. "We did good," Matthew said finally. "We did," Charlotte agreed. "We really did." And there, on that hill, overlooking the life they had built together, surrounded by the land they had worked and the family they had raised, Charlotte and Matthew Armstrong held hands and watched the sun set on another perfect day, grateful for every moment that had led them here, every challenge they had overcome together, every choice that had brought them to this peace. Their love story had begun with broken hands and desperate hope, but it had become something beautiful and lasting, a testament to the power of partnership and the strength of two hearts that refused to give up on each other. This was their happily ever after, earned through hard work and deep love, and it was more than either of them had ever dared to dream.